On a Thursday morning in early November of 2021, Colette Brannagh stood in the cold air behind her apple storage barn in Granger County, Tennessee, and looked at 3,000 bushels of cider apples that were going to cost her everything she had built in the last 11 years. She was 52 years old. She had spent those 11 years converting a failing cattle operation into one of the most respected small-scale hard cider production facilities in East Tennessee, supplying 8 regional craft cideries and 2 restaurant groups in Knoxville, who paid a premium for heritage variety fruit that nobody else in the region grew at commercial scale. She had winesap and stamen and black twig and a Virginia crab variety. She had propagated herself from a single heritage tree she'd found on an abandoned homestead outside Morristown in 2013. She had contracts. She had a reputation. She had a cold storage system she had expanded in the spring of 2021 on borrowed capital because every projection she had said the demand was there and the fruit was coming, and anyone with serious storage capacity in the next 2 seasons was going to be in a strong position. The problem was the rot. Let me tell you what had happened, because you understand how a person who knows their operation as well as Colette knew hers can still arrive at a morning like that November Thursday and find themselves with no good answer in any direction they look. The summer of 2021 had been dry through June and July, which was manageable, and then wet in a specific and damaging way through August and the first 2 weeks of September. Not a flood, not a storm, just a persistent, close humidity that settled into the Granger County orchards and never fully lifted. The kind of weather that apple growers in that part of Tennessee had not seen in combination with a warm October in the same season for as long as anyone still farming in the county could clearly remember. The result was a harvest that came in with surface-clean fruit that tested fine on visual inspection and initial Brix readings, but was carrying invisible pressure bruising and subcutaneous moisture pockets that would not declare themselves until the fruit had been in storage for 4 to 6 weeks. By early November, they had declared themselves. Colette had opened the main barn on a Wednesday morning to run a routine inspection and found the smell before she found the visual evidence. A fermentation smell that was not the good kind, not the controlled, intentional conversion she managed in her fermentation building 50 yards away. This was the smell of sugar breaking down without permission, and when she pulled fruit from the middle rows of her storage bins, she found soft spots that had not been there 3 weeks earlier, spreading through the stored inventory in a pattern that made no sense against the temperature logs she had been keeping. She called her agronomist. She called the extension office. She called the cold storage technician who had installed her expansion units in April. She got 3 different assessments that agreed on the diagnosis and disagreed entirely on the scope. One of them told her the entire main barn inventory was compromised and she should move immediately to distressed sale. One of them told her it was isolated to the outer rows and she could cull and recover. The third told her he wasn't sure and that she should call a specialist. The specialist came out the following Monday and charged her $400 for 2 hours and told her what she already knew. The fruit was compromised. Not all of it, possibly, but the spread was active and the remaining inventory was at risk if she didn't make a decision soon. His recommendation was controlled disposal of the main barn inventory and an insurance claim on the loss. Colette's attorney had explained what that insurance claim would look like in practice. A settlement process that would take 6 to 8 months. A payout that would cover maybe 60 cents on the dollar of her direct losses. And nothing that addressed the contract obligations to the cideries who were expecting delivery by the first week of December. 2 of those contracts had penalty clauses for late or short delivery that her attorney was not optimistic about. She was standing at the barn door on that Thursday morning with the specialist's report in one hand and her attorney's follow-up email on her phone in the other when the truck turned off the county road into her drive. Let me tell you about Nolan Pruitt, because you cannot understand what he offered without first understanding who he was and how he came to know the things he knew. Nolan was 74 years old, and he had been growing apples in Granger County since 1974. His farm was 6 miles east of Colette's operation, and the two of them knew each other the way that small county agricultural people know each other after a decade of proximity. Well enough to exchange information at the co-op meetings, well enough to wave from the road, not well enough to have ever sat across a table and talked seriously about the work. Nolan had come to his 40 acres as a 27-year-old who had apprenticed for 3 years under an older orchardist in Cock County named Russell Babb, a man who had been growing apples in the Appalachian foothills since before the Second World War, and who had opinions about fruit storage that the university extension agents of the 1970s had found old-fashioned, and that Nolan had found, over the subsequent 50 years, to be correct more often than not. He had grown up poor in a specific way that taught a person how to pay attention to the things they could not afford to lose. His first storage barn had been a converted tobacco curing house that he and his brother had insulated and retrofitted with second-hand cooling equipment over 2 winters in the late 1970s. His record-keeping system was a series of composition notebooks going back to 1976, 45 years of temperature logs, moisture readings, variety-specific storage observations, and intervention notes written in a hand that had gotten smaller and more precise as the years went on. He had lost fruit twice in 50 years, once in 1983 to a cooling failure, and once in 1997 to a rootstock disease that nobody in the county had seen before and nobody had quite seen since. Every other year, his fruit had come out of storage the way he had put it in. What most people in Granger County also knew about Nolan, though fewer thought much about it, was that he had a method for managing what he called migration rot that the standard commercial cold storage protocols did not address. He had developed it in 1988 after losing a significant portion of his wine sap inventory to a spreading pocket rot that his cooling system could not contain. He had spent that winter reading every extension publication and university bulletin he could find on post-harvest apple physiology, and when the published literature ran out, he had started writing letters to retired orchardists in Virginia and North Carolina and upstate New York, asking specific questions about what they had done in seasons that resembled his 1988 season. 3 of them had written back with detailed responses. From those letters and from the next 2 seasons of his own experimentation, he had developed a storage rotation method that involved cycling fruit through a secondary conditioning environment at a specific temperature differential before returning it to primary cold storage. It was not fast. It was not scalable to an industrial operation. It required equipment that he had mostly built or modified himself and a level of attention to individual bin monitoring that commercial operators found economically impractical. It had, in the 33 years since he developed it, saved his crop from migration rot in 4 separate seasons when the conditions had been right for the problem to develop. It had never failed him. He had been driving past Colette's operation twice a week on his way to the feed store since mid-October, and he had been watching the way the barn doors were positioned and the way the ventilation was running. He had seen patterns that reminded him of 1988 and of 2003 and of 2011. He had thought about stopping 3 weeks earlier and had not, because he had not been asked and because Colette Brannagh ran a serious operation, and it was not his place to arrive uninvited with opinions about someone else's fruit. But on Thursday morning he had driven past and seen her standing at the barn door with papers in her hand and the posture of someone who had run out of directions to look, and he had turned around at the next crossroads and come back. His truck came to a stop 20 feet from where she was standing, and he lowered the window, and she walked over with the expression of a person who was not quite ready for another conversation, but no longer had the energy to avoid one. Nolan looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I've been watching your ventilation pattern for 3 weeks. I think I know what's moving through your bins." Colette told him. She was brief and without optimism, the way you talk when you have told the same facts to 4 different people, and none of them have helped. Nolan listened without interrupting, which was itself unusual in her recent experience, and when she finished, he nodded slowly. "You've got a migration problem," he said. "The rot isn't starting at the surface and moving in. It's starting at contact points between fruit in the middle of the bin mass and moving out. That's why your visual inspections looked clean for 6 weeks." Colette said, "The specialist told me it was atmospheric moisture from the late August humidity." Nolan said, "That's the cause. What I'm describing is the mechanism. Knowing the cause doesn't tell you how to stop the spread." He paused. "Have you pulled any fruit from the bottom rows of the secondary bin in the East Bay?" She hadn't. The specialist had focused on the main barn. Nolan said, "Before you decide anything, I want to look at your temperature differential between your primary and secondary cooling zones. And I want to see your bin layout." She showed him. "Have you ever had the experience of watching someone look at a problem you have been living inside for weeks and ask the one question that reframes everything? It is not a comfortable experience. It is the specific feeling of realizing that the frame you have been using, the frame your specialist and your agronomist and your extension agent have all been using with you, may not be the right frame, and that someone who pulled off a county road in a 2004 Chevy with a cracked side mirror has been thinking about this differently this whole time." Colette Brannagh was not a person who accepted help easily. She had built her orchard operation from a cattle farm that everyone in her family had expected her to sell after her divorce in 2010. She had done it without a partner, with one part-time employee and seasonal help, against the advice of 2 different agricultural lenders who had told her that heritage variety cider fruit was a niche market that wouldn't sustain a full-scale operation in East Tennessee. She had the particular self-reliance that comes from having been told you can't do something and then spending 11 years doing it anyway. It made her good at her work and not especially good at receiving outside assessment. But she showed him the bin layout. Nolan walked the barn for 20 minutes. He did not rush. He pulled fruit from positions she had not thought to sample: low corners, center depth, the contact zone between the primary and secondary storage areas. He looked at the ventilation intake points with a flashlight and asked 2 questions about her cooling cycle timing that she answered honestly and that he received without comment. Then he walked outside and stood in the cold for a moment looking at the barn roof, which Colette later said struck her as the strangest part, and then he turned around. "Your migration front is moving from the northwest quadrant of the main barn outward," he said. "It's following your air circulation pattern. The cooling system is actually helping it move because the temperature differential between your primary zone and the staging area is drawing the compromised volatile compounds through the bin mass. The specialist was right that the humidity was the initiating cause, but the reason it's spreading is your airflow, not the fruit condition." Colette said, "So what does that mean for the inventory?" Nolan said, It means the fruit in the southeast quadrant and the entire secondary barn has not been reached by the migration front yet. If you move it now, in the next 72 hours, to a different temperature environment, you interrupt the pathway. The question is whether you have somewhere to move it. She did not at the scale she needed. Nolan said, "I have a secondary conditioning barn at my place. It runs at a temperature differential that will interrupt the volatile migration without shocking the fruit. I've used it for this specific problem 4 times since 1988. It's not large enough for your whole inventory, but for the southeast quadrant and the secondary barn, it's enough." Her farm manager, a 34-year-old named Keith Sewell, who had been managing the Brannagh orchard for 3 years, and who had spent those 3 years working with some of the more sophisticated cold storage technology available to small producers, had walked into the conversation at this point. He listened to the description of the conditioning barn with the expression of someone making a significant effort to be respectful. Keith said, "What's the airflow control mechanism in your conditioning barn?" Nolan said, "Manual damper system I built in 1989, adjusted by reading the fruit temperature twice a day." Keith said, "No digital monitoring." Nolan said, "Digital monitoring tells you what already happened. This method requires you to read what's happening. Those aren't the same thing." Keith said, very carefully, "With respect, is there a reason this approach isn't used more widely in commercial production?" Nolan looked at him with an expression that had no particular heat in it. He said, "Because it's slow and it requires attention that most commercial operations have decided they can't afford. That's a business decision. It's not a statement about whether it works." He paused. "You can come out and look at the barn before Colette decides anything." Colette said, "We'll come this afternoon. Let me tell you about what Keith Sewell saw when they drove out to Nolan Pruitt's farm that Thursday afternoon, because his reaction is part of the reason this story gets told the way it gets told when the people who were there start talking about that November." The conditioning barn was a converted structure that Nolan's father had originally built for curing burley tobacco in the 1950s. Nolan had converted it in 1988 and 1989 using materials he had accumulated over 2 years of looking for the right components at the right price. The cooling system was a combination of a commercial refrigeration unit from a grocery store that had closed in Morristown in 1987 and a secondary air handling system that Nolan had built from components he had found in a university surplus equipment sale, and a detailed schematic he had drawn himself based on the principles he had extracted from those letters from the retired orchardists in 1988. The damper system was fabricated sheet metal. The monitoring instruments were analog gauges, 2 of them from the original tobacco curing installation, recalibrated by a man in Rogersville, who Nolan said had been calibrating instruments since the 1970s and who had died in 2014. The temperature logging was done in the same composition notebooks that Nolan used for his orchard records. Keith stood in the middle of this barn for a long moment and said nothing. Then he said, "How precise is the temperature differential you're maintaining?" Nolan told him. He showed him the logbook entry for the last calibration run. He showed him the 1988 entry and the 2003 entry and the 2011 entry, the 3 prior seasons in which he had used this system for the same problem. Keith was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "This is going to sound like an odd question, but have you ever had this validated by anyone outside your own operation?" Nolan said, "The apples came out correct 4 times. I don't know what other validation you're looking for." There was a silence. Colette said, "When can we start moving fruit?" They began on Friday morning. Nolan's son, a 48-year-old named Garrett, brought a second truck and a small loader, and they worked through the day. What they moved first was the secondary barn inventory and the southeast quadrant of the main barn, working in the order Nolan had specified based on his assessment of how far the migration front had traveled. Keith Sewell ran the temperature readings on the Brannagh side. Nolan ran them on his side. They communicated by phone every 2 hours. Let me tell you about the following 10 days, because they are the reason this story is still being talked about at the Tennessee Valley Apple Growers meeting, and in the back booth at the diner in Rutledge, where the people who were there have gathered every January since. The fruit in Nolan's conditioning barn did not behave the way Keith Sewell's experience told him it should. The migration front, which by all expectations should have continued progressing into the moved inventory as it settled into the new environment, did not progress. The temperature differential in the conditioning barn interrupted it exactly the way Nolan had said it would. The fruit temperature readings showed stabilization within 36 hours. By the end of the first week, Keith was pulling samples from the moved inventory that tested clean. On the 8th day, Nolan and Garrett moved the fruit back to the Brannagh secondary barn, which had been thoroughly aired and reconfigured during the week. The fruit came back in good condition. Not all of it. The main barn northwest quadrant was gone, and that loss was real and would take Colette the better part of 2 seasons to fully absorb financially. But the southeast quadrant and the secondary barn inventory, roughly well seen 800 bushels that every professional assessment had placed at serious risk, had been saved. The cideries received their December deliveries. Not at full contract volume. Colette had to have 3 hard conversations with 3 buyers about reduced quantities, and 2 of those conversations were uncomfortable. But the relationships held. The penalty clauses were not triggered. The insurance claim she filed covered the main barn loss at a rate she could work with. She drove to Nolan's farm on a Saturday morning in mid-December with a check and a bottle of one of the small batch winesap ciders she had produced from her 2020 harvest. Nolan was in the conditioning barn running a postseason check on the damper system, and he came out wiping his hands on a shop rag and looked at her without surprise. Colette said, "You saved my contracts. Name a number." Nolan said, "I don't want your money." Colette said, "I'm not leaving without paying you something." Nolan thought about it. The Granger County Young Farmers Program is trying to keep their orchard education component funded. They're short about $800 to run the spring session. Colette wrote the check for $2,000. She stayed for 3 hours. She had come intending to stay for 20 minutes, and she found that she could not leave, because Nolan Pruitt answered every question she asked with the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask seriously. He talked about post-harvest apple physiology in a way that the extension publications didn't, not as a set of parameters to manage, but as a set of processes to understand. He talked about the difference between monitoring instrumentation and observation, about what you learned from reading a gauge every 2 hours versus glancing at a data dashboard once a day. He talked about the retired orchardists who had written back to him in 1988 and what they had understood about fruit that the university programs of that era had not yet formalized. Colette said, "Why haven't you ever written any of this down? Published anything?" Nolan said, "It's all written down." He gestured at the row of composition notebooks on the shelf above the analog gauges. 45 years of it. Colette said, "I mean published." "Made available," Nolan said. "For who?" "The commercial operations don't want a method that requires someone to be in the barn twice a day reading analog gauges. The small operations don't know they need it until they have the problem. And by then, they usually think the problem is something else." He paused. You thought the problem was something else. This was true, and Colette knew it, and she didn't say anything in response, except that she should have asked him about the migration pattern 6 weeks earlier when she first noticed the humidity holding through September. Nolan said, "You weren't ready to ask 6 weeks ago. You had protocols and a specialist and a monitoring system that was telling you the readings were acceptable. You had to run out of acceptable answers first." She drove home with the empty bottle of cider she had brought as a gift. Nolan had not wanted it, had told her to take it home and drink it herself, that he didn't drink much anymore. And she sat at the kitchen table for a long time, thinking about what it meant to know something, for 50 years, that the system around you has no framework to receive. Let me tell you what changed in the years that followed, because the story doesn't close at the barn door. In December 2021, Colette Brannagh changed how she approached the late-season monitoring on her storage operation. Not everything. She kept her digital systems and her commercial cooling equipment, which were good for what they were designed for. But she added a manual observation pass twice a day during the critical 6-week post-harvest window, the period when migration rot was most likely to initiate if the conditions were right. She started keeping a handwritten temperature log alongside her digital records, not because she distrusted the digital data, but because writing the numbers down made her look at them differently than reading them off a screen. She drove out to Nolan's farm every month or two, not for any specific reason, but because she had realized that what he knew about apple storage in East Tennessee was not available anywhere else in a form she could access without sitting in that barn and asking questions, and that she had almost missed the opportunity entirely. Nolan Pruitt is still farming his 40 acres in Granger County. He turned 77 last spring. His son Garrett handles most of the physical work now, but Nolan is in the orchard and in the barn the way he has always been in the orchard and in the barn. Not managing from a distance, but present, reading the fruit, reading the air, reading the season the way you can only read it after you have watched it long enough to know what it is trying to tell you. The conditioning barn still runs on the damper system Nolan built in 1989. He replaced one of the refrigeration unit's compressor components in 2019 and the intake manifold gasket in 2022. Otherwise, it is the same barn and the same system that saved his wine sap in 1988 and Colette's inventory in 2021. The composition notebooks fill the shelf above the gauges in 2 rows now, the older ones with their spines softened and their covers worn at the corners, the newer ones still stiff, all of them in the same hand. 2 seasons ago, a young woman named Addie Schaub, who had started a 3-acre heritage orchard operation outside Bean Station, called Colette for advice on a storage problem that she was having trouble getting her county extension agent to understand. The rot was moving in a pattern the agent hadn't seen before, and the standard intervention wasn't holding. Colette listened to the description. Then she said, "I know someone you need to talk to." Addie said, "Who?" Colette said, "Nolan Pruitt, Granger County, 6 miles east of Mooresburg. He's got a storage method that doesn't look like anything you've seen the certification programs. It runs on 45 years of composition notebooks and a damper system he built in 1989 and the letters of 3 retired orchardists from Virginia and North Carolina and New York who are all dead now. You'll think it's too simple when he explains it. Call him anyway." Addie said, "Will he want to help?" Colette said, "He'll want to be asked." Addie called. Nolan answered. And the conversation that followed was the same conversation he had been willing to have with anyone who asked seriously for 50 years, and that almost no one had asked because the frame that most people use for storage problems does not include an old man's tobacco barn and analog gauges and 45 years of handwritten records as a possible solution, until the specialist has been out, and the attorney has been called, and all the modern answers have run out. Some knowledge doesn't live in a database. Some of it lives in a barn in Granger County, in composition notebooks on a wooden shelf, next to instruments that a man in Rogersville calibrated before he died, maintained by someone who learned it from letters, who learned it from watching, who learned it from running out of acceptable answers in a season that broke the rules, and then spending the next 50 years making sure he had a better answer ready. The specialist will tell you about intervention protocols. The extension agent will tell you about approved storage parameters. The monitoring system will tell you what the sensors say. And then the season will do something the protocols didn't account for, and the readings will stop making sense. And if you're lucky, someone who has been watching longer than you have been farming will come down your county road before you've made the decision that can't be undone. The conditioning barn door is never locked.